Don't get me wrong here, The Last of Us was a groundbreaking game in many ways with revolutionary gameplay and a fantastically presented story. That doesn't mean it's perfect though, and it's certainly not. In the spirit of giving constructive feedback, let's look at what could be, and in my opinion should be, improved in Part 2 over the original Last of Us game that came out a little over 5 years ago. One thing I noticed as someone who's heavily interested in the tech side of things is that The Last of Us had some minor inconsistencies in its graphics at some points. As an example, here in Chapter 10, while most of the area looks post-apocalyptic in the ways you'd expect for The Last of Us, many of the buildings still look largely untouched. This may have had something to do with the original PS3 and its lack of resources, but I would expect at least artistic changes here for atmospheric purposes, if not purely technological ones. Again, I mentioned minor problems, and I think you'll find that to be a trend for this video. I mean, there's a reason for the game having so many 10s on release. A quick note for completionists. Both the PS3 and PS4 versions of The Last of Us make it annoying to platinum since oftentimes specific trophies simply won't unlock for the player, even after repeated completion attempts for said trophy. Still quite a minor note of course, but it's still a first-party game with serious scrutiny and critical reception for both of the platforms it's on, so you'd think that added bit of quality control would be there for the lesser nuances as well. I hope to see this issue fixed in Part 2. Another thing that most players can probably agree on, especially if they've played enough of the game to beat it, is that the game in general can be pretty buggy. Not typically game-breaking glitches, mind you, but one of the frustrating parts about the original game is the melee combat specifically. It's one thing having minor animation glitches being the norm, but when it also occurs during combat, it can also be quite frustrating. While the footage you're seeing isn't exactly the norm, I know over the course of my playing with the game, and I think a lot of other fans too, have also seen their fair share of glitches during combat. It would be nice to see it improved a bit here. Another thing I would like to see a bit less of in The Last of Us Part 2 is a bit less walking. Alright, so obviously there is a decent amount of walking in the original Last of Us when there's story elements or taking breaks from the often difficult stealth and action sequences. I think Naughty Dog tried to implement collectibles and weapon parts in these sections to make it a bit more engaging in that way, but I still personally think they could have done a bit better with these areas by expanding them further and having more engaging forms of gameplay that can still be a break from the regular action. Having mini-games with, for example, pool, or shooting basketball, or potentially even having side quests of sorts that may not pertain to the main story. Another note for more completionist-minded folks, Naughty Dog has a tendency to remove checkpoints in their games on higher difficulty sets, which largely just artificially increases difficulty in a way that mostly makes it simply less convenient, instead of adapting the AI for more players who know more refined aspects of the gameplay. While I understand this approach and have dealt with it many times, I personally would expect more from such a critically well-received developer such as Naughty Dog, even if the demographic I'm referring to isn't their primary one. It's certainly one they keep in mind, however, since they even added a difficulty on top of the already existing ones after The Last of Us released, called Grounded Mode. When it comes to The Last of Us's combat, if you kill all but the last enemy via stealth, he will do stealth-oriented takedowns. However, no matter how you take down the last enemy, it will always be a loud one. While I understand that this is meant as a way to confirm that you've killed all enemies in an area, there are definitely sections of The Last of Us where enemies are still nearby, albeit maybe technically in a different section of the area. I think this makes players feel uncomfortable about the situation and can lead to a false sense of security if you're not careful. Who knows though, maybe this is just me. Still, I think there's a better way to go about this by having the main character voice that it's all clear in this specific area instead of what they did with the original game. I also think this would leave Naughty Dog less restricted in terms of how they could make their maps as well, since the player would know that it's not referring to the entire zone you're in. I think, for the most part, players would agree that the combat feels great outside of semi-infrequent glitches, especially so for the shooting as well. I think other players would also admit, however, that human variation is extremely limited, even if the variation of infected isn't. While there is a focus on various factions within the story of The Last of Us, I think it would be interesting to see more of that. Different groups of people with their own different appearances, weapons they most commonly use, even changes in AI and how they go about combat. I also imagine integrating that in a way that's even more chaotic than what we're used to. Imagine multiple factions of people going against each other, as well as having to deal with the infected and you, the player. I think this kind of change would be welcomed if implemented well enough. And for this video, that's all. I was considering adding a couple other ones, but honestly I'm not sure if they even deserve a mention. So with all that in mind, always remember to have fun.